What is grace? There's so many meanings of the word or uses of the word. A lot of times we miss the power that comes with the word grace. We think, oh, it's a grace period. The bill's due on the 1st. We don't have to pay till the 15th without a penalty. Grace is so much more than that. And especially at a time like this, when you have a loss, one of the most important things you need is grace. Grace, we say, is undeserved favor. But grace is so much more than that. It is the strength and the blessing and the help to carry us when we're down. The Apostle Paul had a thorn in the flesh. He went to God 3 times and asked God to remove it. God said no. Paul had all faith. Paul prayed. Paul had healings and miracles and raised people from the dead. And he asked God to remove this thorn in the flesh, and God said no. Wasn't that like us? We hurt. We want it gone. We lost a loved one. We want them back. But God allowed this pain for a reason, the loss for a reason. He allowed Paul's thorn in the flesh for a reason. And he wasn't going to take it away, but he said this, my grace is sufficient. My grace is sufficient. I know you're hurting. I know you have a problem, but my grace is sufficient. My grace will help you. It will give you the strength that you need to make it, no matter what you're going through. He said, my grace is sufficient. What does that mean? It means if you have a size 5 problem, then guess what God has? Size 5 grace. It's sufficient. He has enough grace to help you through what you're going through. If you're going through right now a size 10 problem, then God has size 10 grace. His grace is sufficient to help you no matter what you go through. What you need to do is say, God, give me your grace. God, give me your grace. Years ago, I was called to the hospital. A lady in our church was hurting. Her husband had just got taken to the hospital and something was very wrong. When I walked into the hospital waiting room, the doctor had just told her, I'm sorry, there's nothing we can do. She was an older lady and a bigger lady, and she immediately just fell out of her chair on the floor, face first. She's laying there on her face, on the floor, weeping and wailing, screaming and crying with the news that she had just been told. Everyone was looking. There were probably 15 people in the waiting room. People are looking at her. No one knew what to do, what to say. I heard that and saw that. I walked up to her and knelt down beside her. And I said, pray with me. God, give me your grace. Pray with me. God, give me your grace. After about the 3rd time, I heard a whisper, God, give me your grace. And then again, God, give me your grace. She prayed it 3 or 4 times. She sat up in the chair. She wiped her eyes and said, it's going to be okay. And people looked at her and thought, what just happened? What happened was God's grace was there. And God's grace is sufficient. You're going through a tough time, please take God's grace. Christmas, Thanksgiving, birthday, holidays. Would you stop and say, God, give me your grace? His grace is sufficient. His grace will help you. When you don't know what to do, you don't know how you're going to make it, God's grace, I promise you, is sufficient. So many times when someone loses a loved one, someone else will say about them to someone, how are they taking it? How are they taking it? They mean, how are they taking the loss? How are they taking the devastation? What they really could be saying is, how are they taking God's grace? Are they accepting his grace or rejecting his grace? We don't have to accept his grace. The grace to be saved, we don't have to accept that. The grace to help us with our problem, we don't have to. There are people in the Bible who refuse to be comforted. Even though God's grace was sufficient and the comfort was there, we refuse to be comforted. We refuse God's grace. Would you please accept God's grace? Grace, and I think the best way to share it is this poem. Everybody knows it. We've heard it. It's my favorite. It's called the Footprints poem. And it says this, one night a man had a dream. He dreamed he was walking along the beach with the Lord. As the sky flashed scenes from his life, from each scene he noticed 2 sets of footprints in the sand, one belonging to him and the other to the Lord. When the last scene of his life flashed before him, he looked back at the footprints in the sand. He noticed that many times along the path of his life there was only 1 set of footprints. He also noticed that happened at the very saddest and lowest times of his life. This really bothered him, and he questioned the Lord about it. Lord, You said once I decided to follow you, you'd walk with me all the way, but I've noticed that during the most troublesome times of my life, there was only one set of footprints. I don't understand why, when I needed you the most, you would leave me." And the Lord replied, "My son, my precious child, I love you, and I would never leave you. During your times of trial and suffering, when you see only one set of footprints, it was then that I carried you." That's grace. God's grace is sufficient. If you let Him, during this time you're going through, He will carry you. I have a pastor friend, and he told me this himself. He said, "Preacher," he said, "I've preached on grace 100 times." He said, "But until my dad passed away, I didn't really know what it was." He said, "It is so much more than a word, it's a power. I felt like God picked me up and carried me." You're exactly right. That's what grace is. His grace is sufficient. Pray as often as you need to, "God, give me your grace," and accept it. And He'll hold your hand. And if needed, He'll pick you up and carry you through this time. God bless you. His grace is sufficient.